I have the absolute honor and privilege to get to introduce one of my favorite educators in the history of mankind, Garreth Heidt, who's at Perkiomen Valley High School in Pennsylvania. Gary, welcome to the first episode of our Unrulr podcast.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and really just, it's been such a great, almost a year now, I guess, since we first met. Christian Talbot introduced us, and everything just took off like a rocket from there. So I'm really happy to be here and to share whatever I can with other people about this amazing thing that you guys are doing.
Thank you. Gary, my first question to you is, what's your philosophy of education?
So I don't know if you've looked into it, but I do have one. And unlike most teachers who write their philosophy in whatever education class they're in, and they make it like a page long, my philosophy of education was something that I crafted in a single sentence back in 1997 or so. And it is that when we trust our students, empower them to take charge of their learning, and offer the necessary guidance, they will astound us. And I am astounded every day by my students, and that's what keeps me coming back every day, except today because I'm sick.
Thank you for joining us while sick.
It's okay.
What do you do? What's your role at the school? But really, what do you do every day?
So my role as written is twofold. I teach English, 10th grade, sophomore English. I have 2 sections of gifted honors English, and I have 1 section of college preparatory English. And then I also have 2 sections of a class that I created with my own students, and it is called Nova Lab. That's short for Innovation Lab. It is an open source social entrepreneurship type class. We're not necessarily interested in creating entrepreneurs, but we are interested in the power of the entrepreneurial mindset to make the world a better place.
Jack, do you have some questions?
Yeah. So, we've seen you do some amazing things, Gary. I don't have as much familiarity with your work as Aaron, I don't think, but I've been trying to dive in and, reading some of your blog posts and really trying to sort of get an idea of what you're working on. And it's super impressive. I'm curious if there's anything sort of in, this school year or in recent times that you've been grappling with, if there's any challenges that you've been facing sort of in the format of your classes, and, I guess just the newness of what you're doing.
Well, yeah. So I was thinking about this the other day, and I think, I don't know, Aaron, I may have been reading Christian Talbot again or something, or listening to something that he was doing. And I've discovered that I really like starting things. There's an energy and I think a charisma to starting things that really will pull other people towards you. If you are possessed of an idea and you have thought that idea over and you've built conviction, other people recognize that. And there's a sense that they want to be part of that too. So for me, I've been lucky enough over the course of 30 years in education to be able to do that almost continuously. And I don't want to say that I live in that, perpetual beta state, because if I did, I'd probably be 6 feet under by now. That's a really hard place to occupy for 30 years. I have, however, had the opportunity to create classes that were not necessarily written before I stepped into those spaces. So back in 1994, really long time ago, my district went through a huge design charrette. We called it a future search. We actually hired a company called the Future Search Network. And they helped lead us in a design charrette guided by the question, what will the graduate of 2010 look like for our district? So this was future planning. This was designing a profile of the learner, like long before a lot of districts were doing it. And one of the things that came out of that was that the people who were there, and this was all stakeholders, like I'm not going to go, like you can just say the demographics of the district, we pulled from everyone. And one of the things that came out of it was a desire to see more of a focus on the arts in the middle grades. I had an interest in creative thinking ever since stumbling upon a book by Roger Van Eck called A Whack on the Side of the Head, How You Can Be More Creative. And they asked me if I wanted to step into this space. And we created a class called Creative Expressions Through Performance. And then for 20 years, I evolved that class. It was different every year because it was tied to, a good deal of the time, it was tied to a local art museum. And we would travel to the art museum every year for different exhibits. And so whatever we were teaching in class was based on what the experience was going to be. That really geared me towards looking at creativity more deeply. And so I became interested not only in creativity as self-expression, which is, we traditionally label as like artistic creativity, but creativity as an applied thing, which is creativity as problem solving, the natural human tendency to look at the world and say, why is it the way it is? How can I make it better? Those two questions, by the way, are on the wall in my classroom. They've guided me since the early 2000s. And yeah, so for the first 20 years of my teaching career, more or less, give or take 4 years or so, I was able to have a space where I was trusted to do the research and to push kids in ways that were not necessarily traditional. When I used to describe it at conferences and things, people asked me if I taught in a private school because it wasn't normal, I guess is not the best word, but it wasn't typical for traditional middle schools. And then I was asked to move to the high school to teach gifted English students. I had not been an English teacher, right, for the better part of 20 years. That was a really hard move for me. I didn't feel like I was done with what I was creating in the middle school, but they were insistent in asking. And the way I took that was they weren't actually asking. They were just being nice. So I moved and the growing pains were very hard. But it was a great experience for me to go through. And one of the things I realized when I got there is that the American public high school, at least in the mid-teens of this century, had created students who were stressed out, sleep deprived, and driven solely by an achievement culture, especially since I was dealing with gifted students, right? Like they were just like, let me check this box off. Let me check this box off. And don't get me wrong. I think, a lot of them were taking 5 AP classes going into 11th grade. Had I been in school, I was good at the game of school. I probably would have been a 4 or 5 AP class student myself. That doesn't mean that was what was best for me. It's just what the system offered me as a pinnacle of experience of sorts. So I wanted to create a space that was different than that. And the only way I thought that I could do it was, one, to create a new class that gave students time to explore things on their own, and for me to help scaffold those explorations and help them learn how to drive their own learning towards productive ends. And then the other thing that was absolutely necessary was that I had to get rid of grades. Grades are inimical to I think the proper growth of any human being in terms of learning. And students who say, no, I need grades are simply responding to the fact that they've been inculcated into a system that creates that need in them. It's not something that they naturally need. I think it's something that the system has forced them to consider. This is how I measure myself and my self-worth. So I created Innovation Lab, Nova Lab. There's a lot longer story there, but suffice it to say, it is that space. It is a space for inspiration, aspiration, respiration, and creation. And all four of those things play a role equally. I wanted a space where I could introduce students to other people and ideas that were inspiring, that they could then take that inspiration and reach higher for themselves and aspire. But respiration and breathing room for them is so important when they are saddled by the mandates of the Carnegie system and however many hours they need in the seat in order to get, a paper that says that they have met whatever it is they need to meet to be considered an educated person. And then creation is simply, that goes back to my roots. Human beings are creators. We do things, right? So that had to have a role in that. So that's basically like sort of a really long way of saying here I am.
It's a beautiful way of saying here you are. One of the core parts of this podcast is tips and tricks.
Yeah.
Like what, and to really like what we're trying to do is, even if someone's not going to use Unrulr, right? Like what can they walk away from? What can they be educated on? And so when I think about you, I think about learner agency. I think about empowerment. If you were to give someone a couple kind of quick tips and tricks on how they either start that journey or how they kind of foster it in youth, what would those tips and tricks be? And feel free to deviate from like learner empowerment. You could dive into like an entrepreneurship program or like PBL, but like what we're searching for are those kind of quick and dirty kind of like tips and tricks that an educator or even a student could put into practice.
When it comes to assessment, authentic assessment, right? Which is what I'm about and have tried to gear myself towards for at least the past decade. Even though before that I was scratching at it, I just didn't know that you could possibly do that. I think the thing in terms of gradelessness to start with is to do some of the research. I was just reading a blog post and the authors posit that the word of the year in education last year should have been ungrading, because it was all over the place. And indeed it was. I mean, ungrading, gradeless, these are just different words for pretty much the same thing. And since that's sort of foundational, that what the experience of school is that most kids have is, when I go there, I will be graded. I will be treated like something that has to, check off certain boxes and other people will do that to me. That really sticks in my craw. Learning is something that we do naturally. And to have somebody else, assess from the outside and stamp you like you're a piece of meat with here's your grade A or grade B, or whatever it is, that's something that I would necessarily, I think, start with. And the way to do that is just to start doing some reading. You can just like type in ungrading or reach out to me and I will send you a huge digital notebook of resources that I have. So I would say you would start there. And how do you start is, first of all, you do the research, but then pick a small project, right? And I would start with projects. Don't start with tests or things, because kids are, and most of the time tests are really hard to ungrade, especially if you're going to be giving them, because that's also another issue with ungrading, is whether or not traditional testing plays a role in that. So I would start with a project. And most people, when they do projects, they probably have rubrics. I would lighten up on the rubric a lot. The idea behind gradelessness, I think I grew into it because I was well versed in design thinking. And in design thinking, when you're doing design-based learning or project-based learning, the ideal projects, the ideal design-based projects are ill-defined in terms of what the problem is, or the student is finding the problem him or herself. And so the definition of the problem is up to the student. So that involves inquiry, right? That involves helping the student to explore why are things the way they are. And so I would start with that, and I would say, okay, we're going to set some standards, call them design specs, if you will. Amy Berval, who's also in Hawaii, I don't know if you guys know her, but she's a teacher in Hawaii, and she has a great blog post, but it's from like a really long time ago. But it's about why she uses design specs instead of rubrics. And so design specs simply say, if I'm going to do this project, here are the specifications that that you have to meet in order to do this project. And if you start there and then lead students through that, and then you're providing feedback along the way. Now, feedback, obviously, that's going to take the place of constantly grading kids, constantly putting check marks down. That's going to take a little bit of an adjustment for the teacher. How do you give feedback on the fly in the most immediate way possible? Because what we know about feedback is that the best feedback is as immediate as possible. It is specific and it is helpful, right? And that's, I mean, there's the doorway for why I connected with Aaron and Unrulr so easily. Because what Unrulr does is it puts the power of that, like, here's what I'm doing. And it puts the power of documenting what the student thinks the learning is into their hands, makes it easy for the teacher to take a look at it, because teacher can't be in 25 places at once. But if the students are documenting their learning as they can through Unrulr, and then the teacher has time to go back and say, yes, yes, yes to this, click off on some of the cogs, add a few lines, or even better, take a day and say, all right, well, we are all going to provide feedback to each other because we're all working on things. We all have knowledge bases. That's what's really going to work. Like if you take a look at one of the projects that I did with my students back in December, was in my English class. It was based on a unit on Carpe Diem. I had the students post their projects in all three of my English classes. They all posted their projects or links to their projects in a united Unrulr class that I created. And then I assigned them 3 other people that they had to give feedback to. And so every person, so long as everyone was on time, which they weren't, but more or less every person got feedback from at least 3 students. And when I was talking about this at EduCon, I showed this at EduCon, a conference here in Philadelphia on Saturday. And I put it up and I talked about what the students were doing. I think the word that occurred to me was just how beautiful it is to read those things, right? It's not, oh, look at the learning that's going on here, even though it is. It's more like it's beautiful to listen to students talk to each other in ways that are meaningful, that show that they care about each other's learning and show that they are learning from each other, right? I mean, that's what we want. And, you know, Aaron calls it a community of commenting or a culture of commenting. I mean, if we want, there's so many ways I could go with this, but I mean, like one of the most beautiful things about this is that when students start talking to each other that way, that kind of civil discussion and openness bleeds over into other things. And that means we're not only creating like this great feedback loop, we're creating citizens who potentially will be better for having had this experience because they'll know how to talk to each other in ways that are constructively critical and also that do more than just praise or condemn each other.